Hello, welcome to a new episode of Plan C, Ocean Interventions to Address Climate Change. I'm your host, Anna Madlener, MRV Manager at the Carbon to Sea Initiative, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Will Burns, Co-Executive Director of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal. Hi, Will.
Good evening, Anna.
Today's episode is a bit different. Will is joining us not just as a host, but also as a guest, actually, because you're one of the lead authors of a new report launched at the UN Ocean Conference 2 weeks ago. It's titled Principles for Responsible and Effective Marine Carbon Dioxide Removal Development and Governance, and it was commissioned by the High-Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy. We're also joined by two co-authors of that report, Terre, who is a professor of culture, risk and the environment at the University of British Columbia, as well as Chris Pearce from the UK's National Oceanography Centre, who is the scientific and technical lead of the CO2CDR project, a Horizon Europe consortium. Both have also been on Plan C before, and we're glad to have them back. Will, before we bring them in, what are you most looking forward to unpacking today?
Yeah, there's a couple of things, Anna. The report's divided into three sections, right? Science, and then governance, and then national approaches. And I think in all three, there's interesting aspects. I think in the science side, some of the MRV questions, as always, are interesting, and the approaches to MRV that they discuss, I think, are a nice summary. I think in governance, talking about some of the emerging regimes, such as BBNJ, is interesting to me. And then I think in terms of the national approaches, how to structure public engagement and how to fund these approaches, I think, is very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. I noticed that for the first time as I was sort of scoping the questions for this episode, I focused not so much on MRV. I was actually also most intrigued by the national governmental strategies and approaches. So I'm looking forward to dissecting it and hearing about some propositions that were made with respect to field trials, community engagement, and I'm excited for the discussion.
Great, let's kick it off.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today.
Hello.
Hello, Anna.
Let's start with a quick word of welcome and an introduction for our listeners. Terry, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm an environmental social scientist at the University of British Columbia, and I come at this with great love of the ocean. I live in a coastal city, so I'm very aware of the many pressures on ocean systems. And I also wanted to recognize Sarah Nawaz, another co-author on this work, who can't be here today.
Great. Chris, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, it's good to see you. Good to be back on this podcast. I'm Chris Pearce. I'm a marine geoscientist at the National Oceanography Centre in the UK, and I'm joining you today on behalf of the science and knowledge team who contributed to this paper.
Awesome. And Will, you don't need an introduction. Everyone knows you, but I'm going to pass the first question to you, which is sort of about the basics of the report. This report was launched at the UN Ocean Conference, and it was commissioned by the High-Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy. And I'm wondering if for our listeners who haven't read it yet, or who know a little less maybe about these types of reports, if you could just share briefly what it's about, what the core purpose is, and the motivation behind it.
Yeah. So let me start off with a description of the high-level panel. So this is a panel of leaders in 18 countries on 6 continents, encompassing a range of highly developed through developing countries, with a core focus on reconciling economic growth in the oceans and recognizing the potential for the oceans to help facilitate economic growth with the need to ensure that it's done sustainably. And the remit here was to help this panel understand the potential benefits of marine carbon removal approaches, as well as some of the risks associated with that, and what kind of incentives may be necessary within these countries to help drive scaling of these approaches.
Awesome. So a pretty influential, I would say, policy realm to receive such a report and to be aware of marine CDR in principle, would you say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, even though it's only 18 countries, it encompasses a large amount of exclusive economic zones, for example, and some pretty influential leaders when it comes to ocean policy.
Okay. And the idea was broadly to sort of raise their awareness for where we're at and what the sort of scientific status is and the technological readiness. Is that correct?
Correct.
Sorry, yeah, just to highlight, actually, the report was requested by the panel members. It was something that they specifically sought further information on. Obviously, marine CDR is a growing topic area. It's something that there is expanding interest in across all sectors. And I think it was recognised by them, by the panel, that they wanted further information, putting on a similar report which touched on marine CDR that came out, I think that was last year, and using the oceans to tackle climate change. And this obviously focused more in the depths and the details on marine carbon dioxide removal.
Okay. And speaking of sort of readiness and technological readiness, Chris, the report groups mCDR approaches into several categories. As the listeners of this podcast know, there is no one single approach. There's many that are encompassed sort of under this broad umbrella term marine CDR. Some of those are more technologically ready than others. I'm wondering if you could explain how you even evaluated the readiness across, I think it was 6 categories in the report.
Certainly, and I think we should start by caveating that this is a perspective on the technological and scientific readiness levels of these approaches. By no means are we trying to be the voice of the sector as a whole. And we recognise, of course, there are many other reports that have come out, all of which have a slightly different nuance, different perspective on the TRL or SRL of these approaches. So I think our evaluative approach was driven primarily from the perspective of trying to highlight the fact that there are different considerations when looking at how ready an approach can be considered for implementation. At this stage, we like to think of approaches as trying to get them ready for implementation at climatically relevant scales, and we are a long way off that. We need to do a lot more research, we need a lot more guidance and clarification before we can tackle all the knowledge gaps associated with them. So in pulling that apart, we wanted to highlight that some techniques may be quite well understood in terms of their scientific concepts and proven in terms of small-scale demonstrators. We're already seeing some of these pilot studies happen. Whereas, as you kind of refer, some of the technological aspects associated with this, or the environmental impacts associated with them as we start to scale up, are less certain. So that's kind of what we wanted to pick out from the TRL, the technology readiness level, or SRL, the scientific readiness level reports highlighted in this paper.
Okay, and I wanted to sort of highlight one nuance in particular that stood out to me. As you mentioned, one of the first, I think, principles was the scientific readiness or the scientific principles, and then things like MRV and sort of technological aspects. I noted that phytoplankton enhancement and macroalgae cultivation ranked higher on the scientific principle readiness than, for example, ocean alkalinity enhancement, which actually just saw the first generation of carbon credits. So I'm curious if you can explain this contrast a bit. So I should also note the rest of the categories for phytoplankton and macroalgae were, I think, lower, either prototype or even lower than that, whereas OAE was further ahead. But that's a pretty stark difference, I think, in the scientific principle. So I'm curious if you want to share a bit more and, put some color on that.
Well, absolutely. And I think that's kind of one of the interesting and perhaps critical findings of our evaluation. When we were looking at what defines the scientific knowledge, we were looking at to what extent is or has this been implemented in real world scenarios. And actually for the phytoplankton or nutrient addition type of experiments, there's been a lot of experiments, over 13 experiments conducted between the early 90s and the early 2000s. So we actually have, as a scientific community, a lot of experience in terms of operating and looking for what the responses would be to nutrient addition, or in that case, iron addition. We also have a lot of natural analogues to look at in terms of nutrient addition processes. Similarly, the macroalgae cultivation sector is very well established. There are people doing this. It's one of the largest marine aquacultures that exists, and likewise, coastal blue carbon, is again a very well established sector. Perhaps less so in marine carbon dioxide removal, but nevertheless, people are actively seeking to regenerate and support the growth of coastal blue ecosystems. So from that regard, we know a lot about what they can do and how they can be implemented, more so than perhaps ocean alkalinity enhancement or direct ocean carbon capture or direct ocean removal, as they inherently rely on more technological approaches to conduct a technique that hasn't been operating in the same rate. However, as you highlighted, the other considerations within our table, such aspects such as technological capability, the material, energy and cost requirements, the environmental impacts, of course, and as well as MRV or monitoring, reporting, verification readiness, they all are significantly different between approaches, and certainly within the nutrient fertilization or the phytoplankton stimulation and the macroalgae cultivation techniques, they are certainly less developed for the implementation of some marine carbon dioxide removal technique. And from that perspective, we did try to collate our overall readiness factors, and in that regard, the chemical abiotic approaches would typically seem to have a higher degree of readiness than the biotic approaches. And I think that alludes to the fact that, as you said, it's the chemical approaches that are already a position of running these small-scale field trials and seeking to sell their credits.
Okay, so the scientific principle is really sort of focused around the demonstration in the field rather than like the underlying scientific principle, sort of.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. I mean, there are things within this table we can't easily capture, aspects such as efficacy, durability, sequestration potential, and for all of them there are big question marks. This is why we need to be doing these field trials. But I think it was more about our the scientific knowledge. Do we understand what we're trying to achieve, and how well constrained is that? What other uncertainties do we or don't we have in regards to that scientific knowledge? And I think it's more reflective of the fact that when it comes to the biological systems that are natural processes that have been studied for a long time, they are well established. There have been experiments. We can look at analogues. Where some for the abiotic approaches, we do know a bit less about them.
Right. Okay. And I think it's notable, as you mentioned, that, for example, environmental impacts or the MRV ability is sort of a separate category also in the table that perhaps isn't all captured in just scientific principle. Speaking of field trials, one of the key recommendations in the report is that you outlined 3 strategies for building R&D networks. I think they include testbed sites, a national lab approach, and public engagement hubs. And Terry, I wonder if you could walk us through these in a little bit more detail briefly, and what you sort of envisioned with the 3 and why those 3.
Sure. My colleagues may have additional things to say, but actually, before I define these, I think 2 things are good to recognize. One is that the conditions the field is facing right now is the fact that the awareness of what marine carbon dioxide removal is, or even what net zero is pretty low. More or less 10% in the global north, a little higher in developing countries with more faith in science and technology, you could say. So China, Taiwan, Malaysia, and so on. So, that's a baseline condition. And then the other piece that's important here is that the area in general is severely underfunded. By different estimates, something like 1/10 to 1/20 of the actual need is funded. So those are the preconditions. So all of these presume that some of those conditions would be improved. So one of them is the test bed site idea. It's really difficult to get permission and permitting for trial for pilot studies. And so a testbed site is just the idea that we would pre-designate some particular marine spaces for that pilot testing. So you could have the permitting done, the evaluation in place, the evaluation technologies in place, and use those repeatedly, possibly for that pilot work instead of reinventing the wheel every time. The second idea there is the idea of national lab networks. We have these for other things, but this is just the creation of kind of publicly funded centers for independent and comprehensive research. Technically, is it feasible? Environmentally, what are the impacts? What are the social considerations and concerns, and can they be met? So these are, focus centers that would share research in these 3 domains across the trials. These could be network centers, they could be physical centers, We have these at universities for other topics. And then the public engagement hubs are really, government-led citizen participation programs to ensure that communities shape what these technologies look like. There's a lot of moving pieces to every technology, and sometimes those design engagements really matter to people, where it's sited, what the source of material is, what the energy conditions are. So we probably all believe in something that we could call the co-design or co-development model of these technologies. And so the engagement hubs could do that work for how a system is designed, run, monitored. And that goes a long way to ensure public safety, environmental safety, and also trust.
Great. And I want to dive deeper into each of these, actually. First and foremost, some of the strategies that you outline, like the National Lab model, for example, have already been seeded, for instance, I believe, under the prior US administration. So I'm curious to what extent the report sort of offers new direction for governments and the ocean panel community versus sort of confirming a course that was sort of already emerging, I suppose, and where we stand in terms of that implementation.
Well, that's a complicated question. I would just say at the outset that, yes, there are models for these. In some ways, the Inflation Reduction Act and all that initiated, the huge investments in place is up in the air right now, of course. But models that are kind of more thoroughly complete that come to mind, some years ago, there was a National Nanotechnology Initiative, and that was a significant funding effort, somewhere in the $40 billion level, and there were public and private entities involved in that. A lot of patents came out of that. So it funded university-based centers that were connected with each other. There were also two big centers whose only goal were the social implications of that research. So, and in some ways, all of these efforts come out of previous examples of technologies that science and engineering communities might think are wonderful, and they just fail entirely socially. So genetically modified organisms were a very big debate for a long time that way. Before that, nuclear power. So I'm not saying that those were wrong or right. I'm just saying that their failure to address these concerns meant, significant changes in policy and technology development that we're trying to correct in some ways.
Mm. And I want to come back to the specific approach to sort of government-led community engagement hubs in a second. Will, I'm curious about your perspective on this suggestion of pre-permitted testbeds. It's not, I think, an entirely new idea in the marine CDR field. I'm wondering how you see the strategy play out in today's world. I think most permitting attempts or successful permit issuances we have seen so far are pretty bespoke examples of a permitting, process, as well as the underlying mCDR approach. And I'm curious how you think this will actually sort of be able to be implemented, and if there's perhaps also a difference between a pre-permitted test bed, which sort of gives this notion of one permit forever stands and then you can do things, or is it an identification of sort of a site where you demonstrate how successful permit issuances can occur, if that makes sense. So I'm curious to get your take on that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, it is going to vary by jurisdictions in terms of how they view that. In virtually every country in the world, there is a possibility of getting a general permit for certain activities based on the characteristics of the activities, right? And so you can apply that if these kind of activities have already ensued. But with something this new, where the regulators are probably going to be particularly precautionary, right? It's hard to know if they'll embrace that approach or if it will continue to be sui generis for any given proposal, right? I mean, I think things will change over time. If you look at what's happening in the United States, for example, where we're just getting our first permits under the Marine Protection Resources and Sanctuary Act, as well as under the Clean Water Act, you're not likely to see an embrace of that more general sort of approach, but perhaps over time that will happen, and they'll use the same principles they have in the past for in other contexts where you could obtain a permit just based on the fact that it mirrors a previous activity.
Right. That's sort of what I think I had started to think of when I hear the term sort of testbed sites, that it's more about identifying a location where you build sort of the muscle and you build the sort of just experience with regulators to even issue a permit for this particular activity. But when I read pre-permitted test beds, I thought of, a site that has a permit to do marine carbon dioxide removal and then sort of can operate on its way. But from what I understand, it's more this sort of first idea that you identify sort of locations where over time you establish confidence in working with these types of approaches. Would that be an accurate sort of assessment?
I think there could still be pre-permitting for testing, and not to assume that because it's permitted for testing, it's permitted for rollout in some way. I think that's a really important piece, because we know that it's a tremendous amount of work to go through any permitting process. Mm-hmm. And some of these technologies might, not work early on and just be taken off the table. And so if we have to sort of start from scratch every time, and maybe the reason is that the energy demands is much higher than we expected, so it's just not viable. Or there can be 1,000 reasons as to why they might not work. But what we don't want to do is kind of have to step back several years with each moment of trial. And we also know that publicly, with some exceptions, people are largely in favor of pilot testing. That's not the part that is as difficult. Not universally, not across the board, but generally speaking, a pilot test is one thing, a rollout is a whole other beast. And so separating those two makes a lot of sense.
So with rollout, you refer to scaling of approaches or continuous dosings. Does it also differentiate necessarily between academic versus for-profit actor in that same sort of separation?
Yeah, good question. I don't I turn to the better legal minds here on that. In theory, no, but that would probably impose conditions on the for-profit investor, which we can just mention now and might come back to later. And, one of the problems with the field is that model, because it's very early days and investors expect, understandably, quick returns on their investment. And that's not a clock that most of the technologies can run on. And so we don't want a situation where you have repeat trials where the information of those trials doesn't become public knowledge, and where you again reinvent the wheel or retrial the same thing unbeknownst because it's privately protected. So somewhere that has to be resolved.
Mm-hmm. So it's the sort of line between for-profit versus academic actors line more so for the reason of learning and data sharing. And perhaps we can talk about how to potentially marry those two later on as well. But one last question on these hubs. I'm particularly interested, Terry, to also hear more about this idea of public engagement hubs. As most listeners probably know, and we've alluded to already, effective community engagement is one of the, if not the most crucial aspect of planning a field trial. And I'm curious what government-funded public engagement looks like. I don't know.
Sure.
So one of you can
share. It looks like many things. I mean, we all know that there are many good public engagement entities within government offices, whether it's, for planning for transportation or, density in cities or other things. So, that's no stranger to most governments at any scale. But on the other hand, when I think of publicly funded engagement, I think of serious research in this space where the engagement is not primarily or only develop the knowledge base or learning. We do want some of that, of course, but it's not solely an educational or a heads up exercise. It's an exercise in more in conversation and elicitation as to what really matters to people about these technologies, about the way they might be governed, and can we implement those ideas in a serious citizen science kind of conversation. So when I think of engagement, I think of it as a research effort to build back into the design of systems and siting and every other piece of the puzzle.
And so a dedicated public engagement hub would be a place where that has been particularly sort of deliberately designed or conducted for a long period of time, or what would that
be? No, I mean, I think of examples like the UK Energy Futures initiative some 10 or more years ago, where there were hubs all over the country investigating in different communities what a change in the energy system might look like to people or could look like to people. And that went a long way to support wind energy in the UK, for instance. That was one of the findings in terms of technologies and siting that worked a little better. People's judgments about these things also change over time. So how to build in some sensibility about the malleability as people learn and technologies become more familiar and signaling about them is negative or positive. I mean, it's a really complicated space, but it has to be a serious and early research endeavor. And yeah, there are some good examples.
Okay. I'm curious if you want to share more about those specific examples and what worked well and what maybe didn't work well that we could draw from.
Yeah, I mean, I have to sort of dig a little more deeply into those because they're a little dated in my mind. But I will say that methodologically, starting from a very initial loose conversations about what it is that people want to know about these systems in the first place and what they're, it's not a tabula rasa sensibility. People go in with assumptions at the outset and, so listening to those and knowing what those are in the first place really matter. But then I think those efforts have to become more structured. We have to agree on, monitoring. Scientists might think that all we need to know is what's happening in the phytoplankton and that will tell us the rest. And the community is really much more interested in particular fishing grounds or particular shellfish harvesting sites and other things that aren't necessarily presumed in that model. So very structured conversations about what matters, what monitoring it well looks like, how that's going to be done. People are very interested in the financial models for the research and for the development. Who's going to pay? Is this a public good? Is it to be owned by a private entity? So, very detailed conversations and structured conversations, including building metrics that people want to have track these technologies over time and not just presuming that we have them off the shelf.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I have one more question that I thought of while you were saying that. To which extent do you think the benefit of these public engagement hubs comes from the fact that it's potentially government funded and done through the government or through a public body, as opposed to it just being independent funding than I guess the project or the company. So my question is sort of targeted at understanding if it's crucial that it's the government who does it, or if trust can also come through other entities.
Yeah. Well, we all know that local governments are more trusted often than federal or regional ones. So that's an important piece. But when, our universities are almost entirely public, there's a very few small numbers of private ones. So when I think of public funding, I also think of government funding for research initiatives that runs through those systems in a competitive way to get the work done. So I'm not presuming that government is the be-all and end-all as the trusted agent, though again, localism matters. But I think that in the same way that we need, back to the testbed, that we need to know what are the sites that are really optimal for pilot testing, for instance, that could be pre-permitted. Back to that conversation. It's equally important to say, what's the development history socially in these sites? And where does this kind of fit into people's visions of a good life and a good future? And where does it completely transgress those? And so take those off the table for options. So, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
One thing I'd add that I thought was kind of fascinating in the section that Terry and Sarah and others were working on was when you think about the question of what the public thinks is important, right? One of the true dilemmas, I think, in many cases, is you may have a discrete, small research project, right, that you want to conduct, but the public is thinking not just about the implications of that project, but the broader societal implications of full-scale deployment of carbon removal, right? And that creates a pretty weighty responsibility for an individual developer, and not one that they can totally respond to, right? But nonetheless, it is almost always going to necessarily impinge on the discussion.
Absolutely. And it's a great segue into my next question, which was going to shift gears a little bit, talking about precisely this sort of dichotomy a bit between scales that I sensed in some aspects of the report. On one hand, you, of course, sort of motivate the reason to even study marine carbon dioxide removal by its potential, if evaluated safe and effective, to really do large-scale carbon removal at likely more efficient, in more efficient ways than more closed system approaches. Yet at the same time, there's really this need to right now concentrate on the coastal zones and on the very discrete local applications, which is also, frankly, where this is even primarily studied at the moment. One place where you, for example, allude to this in the report is that you say prioritizing the development of approaches designed to operate primarily beyond national jurisdictions may ultimately delay atmospheric CDR through marine approaches. And in another place, you say that there are, quote, no fundamental barriers to verifying the larger signals associated with deliberate carbon chemistry manipulation, which to me read as, at global large scale, we'd have no trouble monitoring and verifying what's happening. But the remaining challenge is obviously arising from coastal areas where most of these techniques are currently applied. And there's not an inherent question embedded in this yet. I'm just really curious to get your take on this sort of competition between realities. What's the motivation for governments to be betting on funding marine carbon dioxide removal, and they're waiting for sort of the large scale promise of ocean-based carbon removal, but really you're asking them to focus on the coastal zones? Not you as in the three of you, but generally all of us are saying we have to study it first and effectively. So how do you think this affects decision making, financing? Curious to get your thoughts. Maybe Chris or Will, you have some.
Yeah, sure. Oh, and yeah, thanks, Anna. I think it's an excellent comment and observation. And I think obviously kind of wrestling with the challenges of the marine carbon dioxide removal sector as a whole right now. We collectively, societally, particularly in terms of funders here, you're talking about governments or the voluntary carbon market, people are looking for that golden ticket, the solution that's going to step in and blow everything else out of the water and say, look, this is all we need to put our eggs into this basket. And there are good reasons for doing so. We want to find something that works rapidly, and we can focus our efforts and concentrate what will work and help mitigate climate change effectively. Of course, caveating that nothing will work if we don't reduce our emissions, of course. On the flip side, we can't get to or anywhere towards implementing these at scale, covering 70% of Earth's surface in all the aspects of the ocean, if we don't understand what the effects are, if we don't understand where they operate and where they don't operate, which is just importantly, as well as all the societal perceptions towards those implementations, which will be critical in terms of implementing them. I think, these are comments that Terry's obviously just been alluding to in the desire the need to have these hubs, these pilot testbed and societal testbeds as well. But if we want to start narrowing in on what is and isn't going to be possible, then we have to conduct these field trials in areas that we can access, we can monitor, we can operate in at a high degree of scrutiny, and they will inherently be closer to the shore or in near coastal settings where we can easily access them, we can easily control them, and where we can perhaps throw all of our monitoring capabilities. That said, conceptually, we have the capabilities to monitor at scale. We have the ability to go out there and and do many of the observations that are required. We have the models, we have the sensors, we have the platforms. We just don't have the resource to throw at it to the extent that perhaps we, as scientists and as publics more broadly, would like or would expect to see were this to be implemented at that sort of scale. And I think when you talk about government investing it, people want to put money into something that's going to give a good return, whether it's climatically or financially. But I think people just need to understand that it's going to be a slow step to get there, and we need to be doing everything we can on route.
I think this is for sure a very interesting also change in how the community at large talks about field trials and sort of what's needed for marine carbon dioxide removal, even a change that's occurred over the past 1 to 2 years, I would say. I think prior to that, a lot of the messaging and reports perhaps even were centered around global ocean carbon removal and here's everything that we need to do at global scales. And we've sort of landed maybe back in reality and identifying the initial steps that really need to lay the foundation to get there. So I fully understand the rationale behind saying, first, you have to do it at small scales, controlled, staged field trials. I'm curious if you do think that the fact that there are so many uncertain sort of aspects, and there is the possibility that communities maybe don't want carbon removal at scale, or that through these small scale field trials, we may find out that it's not really scalable in meaningful ways, how that affects like decision makers and governments or other institutions that provide funding, I suppose, because ultimately we want that, or we hope for that large potential.
Yeah, again, I think people will invest in things that they know are going to work. And if you're looking at governments, it's a very different driver to the voluntary carbon market, where the investors are looking for a return. Governments are looking for success in meeting their net zero priorities, and for them the critical limitation might perhaps be the risks associated with that. And to minimize those risks, you first need to demonstrate what is and isn't possible. So they'd be very much interested in what is already operating, what are the lessons learned from that, and how we take it forward. So in both cases, we need to be conducting these sorts of initial steps, these initial field trials. We need to be understanding what scale the different approaches can be implemented at, and in doing so, perhaps what can be pushed further and more broadly in different areas. And I think it's worth emphasizing this has to be a global endeavor. We haven't gone too much into the legal considerations here, but certainly just because a physical oceanographic environment may differ between countries, some of the principles in terms of applying these approaches will apply where you can utilize them. So we need to be looking internationally at the different field trials that are operating or will be operating, and enabling the investors and governments to learn from those to help guide what can or can't be done in their respective jurisdictions.
Mm-hmm. And so maybe speaking of different frameworks, you did say and allude to a number of different frameworks in the report and different regulations that already exist. This one particular one stood out, which is that the BBNJ, the Framework for Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, was mentioned in the report. Well, I wonder if you want to share more about the meaning of that. I think it's one of it's new that this framework is included in mCDR considerations, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe but wonder if you want to shine some color on that.
Yeah, so the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement grew out of the Law of the Sea Convention, but it's a standalone agreement. Theoretically, you could not be a party to the Law of the Sea Convention and be a party to BBNJ. It will come into force when 60 countries have ratified it. I think we're at 50 now, so probably by the end of the year it'll come into force, and it's unclear ultimately how many countries will join. But I think it could have a very substantial role ultimately to play in marine CDR, especially in open ocean approaches, right? And there's a number of provisions that could apply. It has far more precautionary and granular sort of environmental impact assessment framework than the Law of the Sea Convention has, for example, and some of the other regimes. And it has a lot more accountability in some ways when it comes to the environmental impact assessment. It ensures that it's on a public registry where people can see it. It requires or permits the scientific body that's established under the treaty to provide input into that process, which may pressure countries that are contemplating these projects to respond to those suggestions that may come from the scientific body. It also provides for strategic environmental assessment, and that's as opposed to a project level environmental assessment is contemplated for plans and programs, right? And so if we ultimately start having countries developing an mCDR strategy as part of their nationally determined contributions, for example, under Paris, it will provide a framework in which they should be considering the broader implications of mCDR at that level, at that much larger scale, right? And I think that's clearly something that would be extremely important, right? Because it would be contemplated as one of the three legs of the stool, right, in terms of responding to climate change, right? Adaptation, traditional mitigation, and then carbon removal. Maybe the fourth leg is solar radiation management, but for now, right? And this would push countries, I think, to figure out how you would be integrating those approaches, and that would be important, right? I think the other thing that BBNJ does is that might be really important in the context of mCDR is it provides for the establishment of area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. Those could have some substantial implications for where you could conduct large-scale mCDR operations. In some cases, it might privilege them where there's areas, for example, of high acidification. You might want to privilege an approach like ocean alkalinity enhancement, for example, that might help in that context. In other cases, with particularly sensitive ecosystems, it may preclude these approaches from being deployed. And so it creates a framework, I think, that could create that kind of scrutiny. And then finally, BBNJ is contemplated to be an approach that tries to coordinate the responses of different regimes. And one of the things that was pointed out, I think, in the third section of this report, maybe in the second section, is there's a possibility of inconsistent sort of mandates from the various regimes we have that might weigh in on this. London Convention and Protocol, Convention on Biological Diversity, Law of the Sea Convention, Paris. BBNJ, because it has a mandate to coordinate responses in terms of activities that can have impacts in the high seas, could help to reconcile and rationalize those responses across regimes in the context of mCDR. And I think that could be salutary also.
Thank you, Will. That was super interesting and valuable perspective. And we should probably have a completely new and updated episode on the status of current policy and regulatory mechanisms. I want to close the episode by sharing some reflections broadly about the process and the impact of the report. You acknowledge in it that, of course, trade-offs arose from having to generalize across a diverse set of mCDR approaches. I'm curious if you want to share where perhaps some nuance was lost, or you felt that, generalizing is important to know in order to interpret the results.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off. I think it's worth highlighting that although the report itself has ended up being quite long, we were still meant to be limited on how much we put into this. It's supposed to be palatable and not the go-to resource. So naturally, we don't provide all of the context or details, and we do point to other literature references and studies that those who wish to have more detail should go to. But the information contained within this report is inherently at a higher level, and that's particularly reflected in the state of the scientific knowledge section. Certainly, we kind of point to some of the limitations of our knowledge of environmental impacts and monitoring, reporting, verification readiness, and we've done this primarily on a cross-sectorial level, so looking at the chemical and abiotic approaches as well as the physical. But I think kind of barring into that, there are many similarities, things that can be drawn out across them, and things we need to kind of perhaps you could do more detailed work into themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. Those are certainly very nuanced, and if you go into the nitty gritty, they become so complicated. Last but not least, I wonder if you want to share perhaps where it was also hardest to align across the author team, or vice versa, if there was something super easy to align on.
I mean, I would say we did align fairly well on what we needed to speak to. The cross-specialization conversations were good, mutually dependent, but not mutually contradictory for the most part. I think probably each of us would say from our own point of view, there are a few moments of, oh dear. One of those for me might be that, a really important question for all of these technologies is, are they scalable? And the minute you talk about scalable from a sort of public point of view, that's a whole other beast. We are looking at systems that are really significant interventions with a lot of infrastructure likely. And it's not the conversation we're having yet. We need to have it, but we're in sort of early stages of conversation. So when I think about where the research, science and engineering community is on questions of scale versus where the sort of social science community is on how people think about scale, we're quite far apart, I would say, and need to get going on that. And also, there's a lot of best practices guides that are really superb at recommending ethical conditions to develop this area of research. When the rubber hits the road, so to speak, those are difficult to achieve. We don't have a consensus, any of us, I think, on what consent looks like, for instance, or might look like. There are some great, in the section 2, on the legal and regulatory sections, Columbia has done some great work on impact and benefit agreements and what those might look like at a community level. But yeah, there are some big areas where we have barely begun and feel some worry about, for sure.
Yeah, I'd just like to echo what Terry said there. I think we were fortunate in that actually everyone came into this with very open perspectives. We were able to collaborate and work very well. It was put together in a short time frame, like many of these reports often are. And in that regard, actually, I think we should really acknowledge Scott Doney, Katie Liebling, and Ollie Ashford, who were the paper's coordinating authors. They did a fantastic job in getting us going, keeping us motivated, and working to a time frame. And ironing out some of the disagreements. Every person has a perspective or a bias towards different approaches or considerations, but I think we were able to open them, put them on the table, and come to agreement in terms of what the priorities are for the sector right now. And I think actually what we're seeing is this is more or less consistent with what we're seeing in other high-level reports that have been coming out. Obviously, Gazamp released their high-level report and guidance for policymakers at more or less the same time, same week. And Phil Boyd and colleagues have recently had a high-level summary for policymakers out as well. We've just seen that the NASM Standing Committee on Marine Carbon Dioxide Removal has been reinitiated. So congratulations, Terry, on your appointment to that. And we have another number of other high-level papers coming out in the near future. So this is a very active space with lots of aligned recommendations, even though some of the nuances might differ. And I think that's just showing that we're all pointing in the same direction right now. And it's good to be working. It's good to keep the communications going, and hopefully more funding, more field trials, more information and data knowledge will continue to flow into this space, because it's something we're all calling out for.
Awesome. Will, any last words?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was helpful having those three major topics because it did emphasize the interrelatedness of them and how they impact each other, right? And any legal language, for example, that's talking about requiring adequate science, for example, as the London Convention Protocol do, right, to go beyond, research, necessarily has to be informed by that science, right? And this kind of science helps to signal whether we're there or not. It'll still be subjective on the part of the regime if it's adequate, right? But it emphasizes that. And if you're talking about legal regulatory standards, those will necessarily have to include things like public engagement and community benefit agreements, right? And understanding the importance of those and the need to integrate those within the legal framework beyond merely environmental assessment, for example, is an important message, right? And so I thought by working together with people across disciplines and kind of grappling with how to connect all these dots, right? It probably helped all of us connect some dots, and that's great.
Yeah, I think that tells in the report. I definitely, was stuck to it for a couple of hours and was definitely impressed with the connecting of the dots, as you say. Actually, I thought that was really, really valuable and really interesting. Therefore, all of the many questions I've asked you. And with that, I want to thank you for taking the time and joining us on the podcast. And I also want to thank our listeners for joining us. If you liked the podcast, as always, please share it widely, leave some comments. And yeah, with that, I say good night and happy day to all of you. And thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.